All right, let's talk about a special kind of agreement, one that doesn't play by the usual rules, the administrative contract. These are the deals that shape our world. They build the highways, the schools, the hospitals. But here's the twist. The government gets to play by a completely different set of rules. We're going to find out why.
I mean, really think about it. It all boils down to this single question. When the government needs to get something done, like building a massive bridge or getting critical supplies, why can't it just sign a normal contract like you or I would? Why does it need this whole separate legal framework with all these special privileges? That's the core mystery we're cracking today.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start our journey in France, which is really the birthplace of this whole idea. Then we'll see how it traveled and was adapted in Egypt. After that, we'll get right into the nitty-gritty, breaking down the huge differences between these government contracts and regular private ones. And we'll wrap up by clarifying a super important distinction, the difference between the government making a deal and just making a command.
Okay, so to really get this, we have to go back in time to post-revolutionary France. The French were worried about regular courts getting in the way of the government's work. So to solve this, they came up with a brilliant and very direct solution. Instead of some vague theory, they just decided the law itself would point to certain agreements and say, yep, that one's administrative. And this is the foundational concept, right here. It's called contracts by law. It's incredibly straightforward. If the law says a contract is administrative, then it is. End of story. And that was a huge deal because it meant any problems, any disputes, automatically went to special administrative courts that understood the government wasn't just another private party. And the French didn't leave it vague either. They were super specific, identifying these 5 key areas. Think about it. Each one is a core function of the state. You've got public works for building infrastructure, selling state assets to manage property, supply contracts to keep the government running, public loans for finance, and letting private companies use public land. If a contract fit into one of these 5 buckets, bam, it was administrative, no debate, no gray area. Okay, so that's the French model. Now let's see what happens when this idea travels. We're heading to Egypt, which was heavily influenced by French law. But they didn't just copy and paste it. Nope. What we see in Egypt is a really careful, step-by-step evolution of this legal framework to fit their own system. And this timeline just shows it perfectly. Look, before 1946, it was simple. One court system for everyone, all contracts under private law. Then, 1946 happens, and it's a massive shift. The state council's created, and suddenly you have a dual system. By 49, they're starting to follow that French playbook, naming specific contracts. But 1955, that's when things get really transformative. This one little phrase, or any other administrative contract, was an absolute game changer. Seriously. It completely untied Egyptian law from that fixed French list of 5. Suddenly, the power shifted. A contract didn't have to be named administrative anymore. Now, a court could deem it administrative if it met certain criteria. This gave the entire judicial system the power to shape and grow administrative law on its own. So we've traced the history from France to Egypt, but it all begs the bigger question. Why? Why bother with a separate system at all? Well, it all comes down to the fundamentally different purpose behind a government contract versus a private one, which creates this natural, built-in imbalance of power. Here it is, the core conflict in a nutshell. When you or I sign a contract, it's about our personal interests, right? But when the state signs a contract, its goal is totally different. Its number one job is to serve the public interest, making sure that power plant keeps running or that new road gets built on time. And that objective just completely changes the entire nature of the agreement. This table really lays it all out. We've talked about the goal, public versus personal, but check out that power dynamic. A normal civil contract is built on the idea that both parties are equals. An administrative contract? Not at all. The state is given what they call exceptional powers or prerogatives to protect that public interest. This means it can do things that would be unthinkable in a private deal, like changing the terms mid-project or imposing penalties without going to court first. And that, logically, is why you need a separate court system to oversee it all. Okay, one last piece of the puzzle we need to put into place. This is a crucial distinction. The government doesn't just act through agreements. It can also just impose its will all by itself. This is called an administrative decision. And knowing the difference is key. The deciding factor here is simple. It's all about consent. A contract, by its very nature, is a meeting of two minds. It's a handshake, an agreement between two parties who both say yes. But an administrative decision, that's a unilateral act of one will. Think about the state issuing a driver's license or appointing someone to a public office. It doesn't need your agreement to make that legally binding. And that leaves us right here, with this central dilemma at the very heart of administrative law. We give the state all these special powers so it can effectively serve the public good. But doing that creates an inherent inequality. So the real question is, how do we balance the need to get things done for the public with the need to be fair to the private companies that partner with the state? That's the tightrope that administrative courts have to walk every single day.
You know, when you think of a contract, what comes to mind? Probably a deal, right? A promise between two equal sides? But what happens when one of those sides isn't a person or a company, but the government itself? Well, it turns out not all deals are created equal. When the state pulls up a chair to the negotiating table, the entire rulebook can get tossed out the window.
Okay, let's just get right into it. On one hand, you've got your standard private contract. Think of it like a perfectly balanced scale, built on total equality between the parties. But an administrative contract? Whoa, that's a whole different animal. The scale is tipped, and it's tipped on purpose, giving the government more power. Why? Because it's supposed to be acting for the public good.
So, how are we going to wrap our heads around this? Well, here's the game plan. First, we'll break down the three essential pillars that make up these contracts: public authority, public service, and these so-called strange powers. Then, we'll get into how to tell them apart from other legal agreements before we hit the final balancing act.
All right, let's kick things off with our first pillar, public authority. This is all about who is signing on the dotted line. Now, you might think anytime the government's involved, it's automatically an administrative contract, but it's actually way more nuanced than that. It's not just about who you are, it's about how you're acting.
So the first piece of this puzzle is that one of the parties has to be what's called a public legal person. And that's just the fancy term for an organization like the central government, a local authority, or even a public university, basically any entity that was created specifically to serve the public.
That leads to a perfect question to test this idea. So let's say a public university signs a simple contract to buy a bunch of pencils for its offices. Is that an administrative contract? Does the simple fact that a public entity is involved automatically tip those scales?
And the answer is a big, clear no. For it to count, that public entity has to be using its special public authority, its unique governmental powers. If it's just acting like a regular business, maybe trying to make a profit or just buying supplies, it kind of steps down from its throne. The power balance is restored, and the deal is just a normal private contract.
Okay, time to throw a real wrench in the works. Picture this. A public agency signs a full-blown administrative contract for a huge project, but halfway through, that agency gets privatized. It's now a private company. What on earth happens to that contract?
Believe it or not, the contract actually transforms. In some legal systems, like in Egypt for instance, it changes its identity right in the middle of the game. It starts out as administrative, but the very second that public party goes private, boom, it morphs into a private contract. The big takeaway here is that the public status has to stick around for the entire ride. Let's move on to our second pillar, which builds right on top of the first. See, it's not just about who the parties are, but also what the contract is for. The purpose, the why behind the deal, is absolutely everything. And that why has to be connected to a public service. This brings us to a really important concept, the public facility. Now, this isn't just any old government project. We are talking about something the state manages that has to run continuously to meet a core public need. Think the power grid, a public hospital, or the national highway system. And this makes the point perfectly. Let's go back to our university. If it signs a contract to build a one-of-a-kind particle accelerator, well, that's directly tied to its public mission of research and education. That's administrative. But if it's just buying standard air conditioners for an office, that link to the core mission is gone. It's just a regular commercial deal. And now for our third pillar, which, honestly, is the most mind-bending of them all. This is about the special powers that are written directly into the contract. These are called exceptional clauses, and they include stuff you would never, ever find in a normal business deal.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. There's this famous quote from the French Council of States describing these clauses as granting rights that are strange in their nature compared to private law. And strange is the perfect word because it really captures how much these terms break away from our idea of a fair deal.
So what are these strange powers? Well, for one, the government can just unilaterally modify the contract's terms. It can supervise every tiny detail of the work. It can even change the project's methods, all without the contractor's permission. It's designed to make sure a public project can adapt to new needs, but it completely shatters that fundamental rule that a deal is a deal. Okay, so we've got our three pillars. But the law is never that simple, is it? So let's look at how you can actually spot an administrative contract out in the wild and tell it apart from other legal documents it might get confused with. First, let's put it head-to-head with a standard civil contract. The huge difference is the goal. An administrative contract is all about the public interest. A civil contract, that's about personal interests. And this changes where you fight about it, too. For administrative contracts, you go to a special administrative court, not the regular ones. And what about an administrative decision? This is a key distinction that can trip people up. A contract is born from the agreement of two wills. The government and the contractor both have to agree. But a decision, that's an action of just one will, the government's alone. It's a command, not an agreement. No consent needed.
Now let's get into a huge exception that really tests our understanding of this whole thing, the concessionaire exception. So imagine the state builds a highway and then hires a private company to operate it. Here's the crazy part. When that private company signs its own contracts for stuff like road repairs, those contracts can also be considered administrative. Why? Because that company is now managing public money and a public asset.
Wow, we have covered a ton of ground, from the three pillars to some pretty wild exceptions. So let's bring it all home and really get to the heart of the final balancing act and the why behind this whole concept. So here's your simple three-point test you can use. First, is a public authority involved, and is it using its special powers? Second, is the whole point of the deal tied to a public service? And third, does it have those strange one-sided powers? If you can check all three of those boxes, you are almost certainly looking at an administrative contract. This chart just says it all, doesn't it? In a normal private contract, you're shooting for a perfect 50-50 power balance. But look over at the administrative contract. That scale is intentionally tipped, maybe something like 80-20, heavily in favor of the administration. So why would anyone create a system that seems so imbalanced? Well, the goal isn't to be unfair just for the sake of it. It is a legal framework designed to do one thing above all else: put the public interest first. And if you can understand that intentional imbalance, you really understand the entire concept. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. In our modern world, which is full of these public-private partnerships, the lines are getting blurrier all the time. It forces us to constantly ask ourselves, where do we draw that critical line between the power the state needs to act for all of us and the fundamental rights that belong to each of us as individuals?